Today's webinar is about how we can use a SharePoint intranet to drive employee productivity and engagement. I'm joined today with my co-host, Ben. Who's this webinar for?
Yeah, absolutely. So this webinar really is for anyone in SMB size organizations. It's really for anyone in the leadership team, or let's say you're an information manager responsible for part of an existing intranet or in some form of people role. Or again, if you're looking at thinking about, taking on an intranet project and running that. So let's say if you're thinking about starting an intranet project and you want to find out about what you should be thinking about as part of that process.
And so you talked about the people leadership. It's not a strict technical demo. We're not talking about clicking of how to set things up as an intranet. It is much more of setting the scene, setting the picture. Given that, what are the takeaways that people can expect from attending this webinar?
Yeah, as we can see on the screen, we're going to cover a few key things. So first of all is talking about this concept of an Intranet Charter and why that's important. What does that actually mean? What does it do? And why do you need one? We'll then be thinking of that concept of making an intranet needing to be open for everyone to contribute to, not just a place for the leadership team to push their information out. And then finally, to support things like productivity, we need to allow, or what the internet should be doing is signposting and highlighting that key content, key work elements, and the data that people need to be able to do their jobs.
Okay, so we're going to talk about a charter. We're going to talk about how an intranet needs to be open to be for contribution to get everyone involved. And then finally, there's that productivity piece as well. So it's the apps, it's the data, the things which enable us to get our job done every day. Ben, what I want to do is start just by taking a step back and ask the question, why do we even want an intranet? For many organizations, they've survived so far without an intranet. What's changed?
Yeah, so when I talk to our clients about what the purpose of an intranet actually is, I always highlight two key things. So the first and perhaps obvious one is about supporting employee engagement. And then the other one is supporting or improving employee productivity. So I think if you're only addressing one of those elements, and typically you might see in a larger organization, it really focuses purely on the engagement, but really it needs to cover both. And I think just reflecting on the fact that the way the organization's work has changed over the past couple of years, even smaller organizations that don't have an office for people to come to anymore, it's quite important to make sure that the intranet is there to represent or reflect your company culture and give people access to the tools that they need. Whereas historically, they might be able to just walk over to someone's desk and ask a question, as we've moved much more into this sort of remote working or hybrid working sort of behavior.
So let's ask a few key questions. And one of the things I know we do with our clients is talk about the Intranet Charter. Now, I put a few key questions here on the screen. I'm not going to read them line by line, but maybe, Ben, you could just take me behind why are we asking these questions and what are good answers?
Yeah, when we think about the Intranet Charter itself, I tend to think of this as the terms of reference for your intranet. So, as we said before, you really need to sort of highlight what the intranet's purpose is going to be. And we're not talking about a list of features. It needs to be able to do news and have widgets and bits and pieces. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what business objectives is this going to support. We need to define what is going to be included and what isn't. Is it going to integrate with HR system? Is it going to be covering this? Is it going to be covering news, et cetera, et cetera? What is it actually going to be doing? So that's clearly demarcated. We need to define who it is going to be for. Now, ultimately, it's going to be for everyone, but you need to identify how are people going to access it. If you have a load of frontline workers that perhaps don't regularly have access to desktop computers or aren't generally knowledge workers, how are you going to make sure that they are included in the messaging and in terms of the reach out of the audience? And then finally, once you've considered all of that, you need to think about who is the actual sponsor of the intranet going to be. This is not about who is going to be responsible purely for getting the project to deliver a new intranet up and running, but ultimately they're going to be the people that are responsible for its success on an ongoing basis. An example of who is not a good candidate is purely an IT role. Really, this should come from the business, potentially someone in the leadership team for an SMB size organization that needs to be that overarching sponsor.
One of the examples that we have here is a sample charter which talks about employees and it talks about connectivity. And as we've said here, all levels of the business, maybe as those frontline workers, those Microsoft defined people who typically aren't on a PC all day, why we're doing this intranet. And in smaller organizations, it's carry multiple roles. Certainly in very large organizations, you might see the internet purely as a communications platform. In the small organizations, we've got to look at productivity as well. We want a single place where everything comes together. Is there anything else to add on that, Ben, or shall we actually have a look at what intranet might look like.
Yeah, I think just a final point, really, again, as we're saying, this is talking about the vision of what the intranet is doing as opposed to being a feature list. We're not thinking about it needs to be able to do X, Y, Z. We're thinking about what the outcome is going to be by having this thing in place. Yeah, I think that's the key takeaway, really.
So separate the technology from the vision, and then the technology supports that vision. Okay,
Exactly.
let's bring up our intranet here. Ben, I think the first thing to notice, I'm noticing we're in Microsoft Teams.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think obviously with the move to hybrid working, obviously Microsoft Teams has become far more prevalent, and there's sort of rapid adoption that we had in the middle of 2020 as such. So, and what I would say to that is that if anything, it's becoming the tool that's almost replacing Microsoft Outlook in terms of the tool that people have open every day, certainly approaching the level of usage that Microsoft Outlook might be getting. What we're doing here is highlighting that we're bringing the intranet to the tool that people use the most often. Instead of having to worry about setting up things like default browser homepages and all that kind of thing, we're bringing the intranet to the place where people are working, which is Microsoft Teams. Rupert, if you just hover over the navigation a minute, let's call out a couple of key elements. So within the navigation here, we're just signposting the key things that you need to publish on your intranet. So we're breaking it down, not necessarily by departments, but more about the types of resources and content that people need to access. So that policy hub, the sort of common policies and procedures that people need to access. Things like document templates and standard resources, and then thinking about the people element, the HR questions, how do I access my benefits, all those types of things, and resources for new joiners. But then as we look along the navigation there, it starts taking us into the areas where users will go and do their daily work. So whether it's a project summary area, whether it's a client's area for that kind of commercial element, working and storing the documents related to sales, and then finally getting the benefit out of the knowledge that we have in our colleagues and that sort of written down process of how we deliver our projects, for instance.
Okay, cool.
So it's, very much that entry point into everything else. And again, looking, shall we say, above the fold, i.e. below before we have to scroll down, we can see that top-down news communication. We can see the news messages that people are communicating, but then also on the right-hand side, we've got the common tools that people need to access. So even before we have to scroll, we're addressing and thinking about both of those elements of engagement through content, but productivity through common links and tools for people to get to what they need.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. With this, I've got everything on Teams, and you notice Teams is in the browser, but the same difference if you've got the thick client. But then where else do I do my work? I use chat, I use Teams to collaborate. So it's all on one pane of glass.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just go and scroll down a minute. We'll just go that far. Yeah, that's it. Again, as we go a bit further down on our intranet homepage here, we're bringing more of that productivity and individualized aspect of the work that people do. Looking at my list of recent documents, the intranet is directly relevant to me. I can see that most recent document I've been accessing. I can get to it quickly. I can see the sites or the projects that I might be accessing. But then also I've got some visibility of any upcoming events. Again, I'm always thinking about engagement and the productivity elements, but on a slightly more personalized aspect here.
Perfect. Okay, Ben. So does that set the scene nicely for the rest of the webinar?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I'm just going to come back to the deck here. So there's two areas we're really touching on here is the productivity and engagement. And yes, there are some blurred lines between the two. But first, let's focus on the engagement piece. Who's this for, Ben? What's this all about?
Ultimately, this is for everyone, but we tend to think about it as different layers of the organization. So when we think about, as you say, who has got something to say, initially we're going to be thinking, of course, about the leadership team and what they need to communicate out. But then as we go further down, we need to look at how various different departments will have news stories and things that they want to highlight. It might be key announcements. It could be, celebrating a new member of the team that's joined, or if perhaps it's someone in the sales team that wants to shout out about a successful new deal or a project that's been completed. So allowing those departments to almost blog and share their success with everyone adds a lot of value without having to create a lot of hoops to jump through to get content onto the homepage. And then finally, last but not least, we need to think about the individual. So whether that is capturing individual employee feedback, which is what we might traditionally think about, but then also how do we support those conversations in groups and connections, whether it's social elements or whether it's working on projects and collaborating together, asking for help. We need to support all layers of the organization within our intranet. And ultimately, that brings together our organizational culture and should reflect the culture of the organization.
Great. Okay, so we've talked about it from a theoretical standpoint. Should we see how this translates into our SharePoint intranet?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go and do that. If you want to go and bring back to the Intranet homepage and scroll up a minute. So let's start by looking at some of these news stories we've got here. And we're thinking about that leadership connection or sort of leadership content, first of all. Just an observation, quite often when I speak to organizations, they'll often want to go and share or replicate the news stories that they've put on their website and show that content internally. And there is some value in that. But the problem is that if you think about the content and the news that you put on your website, the audience is your customers, whereas the content that you're putting on your intranet, the audience is your employees. So when customers ask me, why is no one looking at our intranet? I say, well, because you're not creating news stories that are relevant to your employees. You're creating news stories relevant to your customers and showing them to your employees. All of the stories here are actually relevant to an employee and the things that they care about, whether it's about a new office or maybe the survey that you're going to carry out or celebrating a new deal win or a new colleague that's just joined. All of this content has been curated and thought through appropriately instead of just being a rehash of stuff on your website. So if we go and click perhaps inside that new joiner story there. So we can see once we get into these stories here, they're nice and visual. They look quite clean. It's quite easy to just go and create that content. And then over on the right-hand side, we can go and hover over this new joiner's name and we get that interactive view so we can see a little bit more about them, whether we wanted to go and communicate with them, start a conversation, or perhaps see where they sit in the organization, even see who they report to and where they fit. And then finally, Rupert, if you just have a little scroll down, of course, these news stories in SharePoint support the ability to add comments. So you're again starting to bring in some of that element of two-way conversation here. So if someone's joined, someone's created a nice story about this new joiner, and then someone can come in and just make a nice comment to welcome them in. Again, it just makes them feel part of the organization that they're joining.
I really like the template because it prompts to questions. So you're not starting from a blank piece of paper, which often terrifies people, saying, what do I write? And that also drives level of consistency. So if you're empowering sales team to talk about their new joiners, then we can also look at maybe different teams, operations teams, delivery teams. So people get a consistent experience of what to expect when they find a new joiner document.
Yeah, absolutely. So Rupert, just take us back to the homepage a minute. I think another common thing that does get mentioned here, if we could go into our company town halls area, please.
Okay, so company town hall, we're talking about meetings or organization wide. It is an American term. It's come across the Atlantic here, certainly with those US firms with a presence in the UK. So Ben, what have we got here?
With the move towards hybrid working, we start to see a lot of these sort of all company presentations where you might talk about your strategic vision for the next year. A lot of those things move to being carried out through Microsoft Teams and will probably stay that way in some shape or form moving forward. But what we're doing here is reflecting that on the intranet. So we can see perhaps if it was the most recent PowerPoint deck that was presented at the recent town hall, someone can click through and interact with it straight on the homepage there. We can see a list of any upcoming events that might be being run, whether it's staff get-togethers or the next quarterly results, for instance. So we can see that content and we bring it together in a single place. Then finally, if we go down to the bottom, what we'll see is when people run those town hall meetings, just make sure that you're recording them. Even if some people are attending in the office and some people are attending remotely, just make sure that meeting is actually being recorded so that perhaps someone who wasn't able to attend for whatever reason, they can actually see that recording. And again, perhaps if there's a new joiner that only joined a week after the last presentation, it'd be really beneficial for them to be able to go and see where the company is going, what that strategic vision is by accessing the recording here.
Yeah, I think a lot of people aren't aware, but within your Microsoft 365 license, you've got all the tools you need to do this. So it's just about SharePoint and then bringing that all together, Microsoft Stream, those other products behind the scenes, and producing this single view. So from a user experience, it all ties together, but you've got lots of clever things working behind the scenes. Microsoft Teams creating the recording, Stream publishing it, and the presentation layer through SharePoint. So it's really nice when it all comes together.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the final thing, let's just go back to the homepage a minute. We find that in organizations, they may still be running something along the lines of a monthly or a quarterly newsletter. And again, for those people that perhaps do spend more time in Outlook and don't always go to the intranet, what we can show here is how we can create a news digest and actually bring that through. So Rupert, yeah, if you want to go and click on the see all link here. Let's say, for instance, you wanted to do a monthly summary of the most popular news stories for that month. You can go through, create this digest, pick and choose the news stories that you want. And again, maybe if you wanted to do a slightly tailored set of news stories to the support services or to the sales function, for instance, you can do that. So we're just going to go and give that a name, March News, for instance. Yeah, okay. And then we're going to go and just enter in one of our distribution lists, which is the all company group here. Just put a little simple message. That's fine. Okay, good stuff. So we're just going to go and send that out. So now that that's gone, let's just go and take a quick look at your email, Rupert. So we should see that come through pretty quickly. What we can see here is that SharePoint has generated this email with all of those stories embedded. You don't have to go and construct a separate email. It's provided the previews, it's pulled out the imagery and the sort of initial content. And then if someone wants to interact with it, they can actually click on the link and it'll take them back to the intranet itself.
I think what's really nice about this is often when organizations have tried an intranet and maybe it's gone a bit stale, and then you've put a new bit of energy behind it. If you want to bring people back to your intranet, then by publishing a digest, people start to realize, oh, okay, the intranet's back in swing here. I can see the content is coming back again. I'm going to bring people back in again. So it's a nice way to bring people back in. The second thing is we did an all company email. You could create separate news article, news digests, maybe for delivery teams or sales teams. So you can be even more specific on depending on the kind of information that you want to highlight to them. So that's a nice little feature there, which can bring people back to intranets and remind you that you're still there, particularly maybe people who don't use Teams, talk about these frontline workers, Teams, and maybe more email based. Okay, Ben, so talked about news. We talked about the news digest as a nice way of publishing information and highlighting, I guess. So where do we go from there?
So I think what we can see with this particular news story that we've come back into is that this is actually one that's been generated from the sales team. When we talk about how we make it easy for departments to produce content where they're not necessarily content creators or internal comms people, what we need to do is make that process for them as easy as possible. And the way that we do that is by creating some standard page templates that they can use. Rupert, would you mind just going to the homepage a minute?
Yeah, so I click on the sales here and I've got my sales views here. And on the right, I've got a bit of my sales team actually, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're going to do is just go and create a new news post.
And just the context of this page, Ben, I think this is the words you described earlier to me was, this is the shop window of the sales team. So this is not the area where sales come and collaborate on their sales proposals. This is what we're telling the rest of the world or the company anyway of who we are, how to get in contact with us, what's going on in our world. So as you said, we're going to create some news. We talk about this news link here of how you can take a link from a public website and it will drop it into SharePoint. We also talked about the context of that not adding a lot of value because it's not targeted to the right audience, an external audience, not an internal audience. So let's dive into a news post. And Ben, I see we've got some templates here.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got two templates that we set up to make it the process a bit easier for people. So we're going to look at that. Let's click on the new joiners template first of all. So again, the idea about this, let's say you've got a new member of your team, you might have a standard set of simple questions that help people get to know a bit more about them. So that may be some business questions, but also a little bit more about their personality and what their interests are. And again, we've got a new deal win template. So if you go and click through that, we can see, again, a standard simple set of questions that we would follow. So we're not having to get those people who are really busy doing other things. They don't have to think an awful lot about what they need to put in. They don't need to worry about designing pages and finding images. We've done a lot of that for them. So if we just go and click on the Create Post button, we can see a lot of that structure has already been put in place. And it allows people to just go in and fill in the blanks. You're asking the questions, they can just go and fill in those specifics. So what Rupert's going to do now is just go and grab his content from a Word document there and just go and paste that in.
What I like about this, Ben, is it gives me a framework, but if I haven't got an answer for a question or I want to write some additional content, then I can do that. So this is not super locked down. And if you're looking for that super locked down experience, SharePoint probably isn't the answer in that respect. Because we don't want people to be creative. And if there isn't a good answer for a question, then don't publish it. So we've got that flexibility. I'm going to go over to right here. I'm just going to change the deal size. Let's make it a little bit smaller. And let's talk about medical devices. We'll leave the technology as is, which is SharePoint and Power Automate. Now, I have got the option here to change the image at the back. I'm going to leave it as is for this one, but you have got access to a library of images with SharePoint. So, Ben, is now a good time to post this?
Absolutely. Yeah, let's go and do that. Okay.
So there we go. We have news.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just go and take a quick look at the sales homepage. And what we'll see is that new story has already come through straight away. And I think, as Rupert was saying earlier, it's a little bit of a thought on what the sales department homepage is. It's not that collaborative space. It's more a shop window of what the salespeople are doing, so that someone that new that's joined the organization can find out a bit more about them. But again, this now leads into the sort of individual conversation piece, which is, how do I start as an individual having a direct conversation with people in sales and effectively ask them questions and ask for help? What we've embedded here is the sort of Ask Sales forum that we've created using Microsoft Yammer, and embedded that onto that homepage. So this gives an avenue for people to go and ask questions to the sales team, who will then go and see it and be able to provide answers and signpost people to that sort of correct content.
Yeah, I think there's a general point about where does Teams fit in, where does SharePoint fit in. As a rule, I know a more technical of you will know that Teams uses a lot of SharePoint behind the scenes, but from a user experience, our general rule is that SharePoint is for curated content, things that you can be trusted. If I see it here, it's an official version of the truth. Teams is a place where we create that content, so that's more that collaborative space. So there may well be a sales team or sales teams with various channels where they actually do and work on their various deals and proposals. So,
Absolutely.
Ben, we created news, we talked about the sales department, and now we're talking about the individual.
Yeah, so this, as you say, this kind of leads us down to the individual. So I think we don't want to forget the concept of the employee survey. So let's just go and take a look at that. So we've set up this employee feedback page here. And the idea is that this gives you, in fact, actually, because we ran this webinar earlier as well, and we've already submitted a response. But the idea here is that we've actually embedded a Microsoft form onto the page that allows people to go and fill in their responses. You may be using something like SurveyMonkey to gather feedback from your customers, but Microsoft Forms actually provides a tool to do that. And as we can sort of see, and we'll see a little bit more in a minute, that is directly integrated into SharePoint. So you can create a sort of an overarching experience that gives some context around the survey. And then, of course, it gives you the ability to go and view some of the previous surveys that have been carried out on what the response and what the action was. So if we go and click into the previous surveys, Rupert.
Yeah, I think a lot of thing is that we do surveys and then nothing happens or it goes into the abyss. A couple of things I really like about the Forms solution within Microsoft. A, it's included in almost every license. B, you still can be anonymous whilst letting people complete the survey only once, so it separates the data from who's actually completed it. And thirdly, you can actually make these externally accessible, so you don't need to authenticate to access the forms. So if you want to send a survey or a form out to a customer base or supplier base, you've got the option to do that.
Yeah,
okay, Ben.
Absolutely.
Here's my survey results.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the point that Rupert was making, is that the first thing we're showing is the leadership team's response. So actually, we created a page that allows them to reflect back and talk about what they're going to do as a result of that survey. But if someone wants to actually go and see the individual results, they're able to go and click through here and actually see that native view. So what we can see, there was a net promoter score. So how likely would you rate our company? That on the whole is quite positive, which is great. And we can see a bit of a highlight of some of the responses that were given. So if you do want to publish that, to make it open and allow people to see what's being said, then people can go and click through and see all the live results, as well as the leadership team doing a bit of a summary of what the overarching themes and actions are going to be.
You don't have to publish this information. The survey results can just disappear, but we're just showing you what you could do if you chose to, or you could just choose to publish this to an audience, maybe just management or leadership team, as Ben talked about earlier. So Ben, we talked about employee feedback. What other ways are employees looking to contribute in an intranet?
Yeah, so I think that we do really need to come back to that one-to-one or sort of conversation-based. I think employee feedback surveys isn't enough to really get the engagement. You need to allow and support people to feel connected, and the intranet should reflect that connection. So Rupert, if you could go into our social area, for instance. what we're going to do is just highlight, we've created this sort of summary page here, which reflects the various different social groups that may start to appear in an organization. Now, the typical one that people would often see is the weekly five-a-side football club historically. Recently, we've been getting into doing a bit of a board game club and some of these other things. And again, on the right-hand side, let's say that someone had an idea for a new club that they wanted to start, and they want to get a bit of buy-in or engage how other people might be interested in it. Then they could go through and fill in a form, perhaps if they wanted to use some of the company office space to carry out club events, for instance. So people could go through and actually go and fill those responses in and have people address them. As we go further down, we get that roll up of perhaps events that might be carried out. When are the next meetings? I don't know if you've ever used Meetup, for instance. I use Meetup for other things. They have a similar kind of concept. What are the various different events that are happening across the different clubs? And having all of that presented on your homepage, it almost becomes like that concept for your internal organization. And then finally, you get that conversational element to it so that people can actually go through and ask questions and discuss. So let's just go through into the board game club there, please. So once we get into this page, really, it's just a bit of a summary. Okay, so what we're looking at SharePoint is a bit of a summary, but the key thing really is that conversation piece. So this is bringing that two-way dialogue, allowing people to ask questions, maybe talk about rearranging or booking in the next session that they want to do, when it's going to work for everyone, what game do they want to play. And as we go a bit further down, we're really asking the important questions here. What do you do with the Monopoly money fines? Really important. So we can see that people are responding to that, and then other people might go through and mark that, yeah, that's the best answer. That gets upvoted effectively.
Yeah, so one thing I want to highlight here, one of the powers of SharePoint is what you notice on this page is we've got the events purely relating to the Board Games Club. If I go back a level, we can also include events from maybe escape rooms and cycling clubs. And then on the front page, we can bring all the events together. So as you drill down, maybe that list of events can be more and more granular based on where you are in the hierarchy. So it's quite smart. You're not recreating those events in lots of different places. And that's common with other information such as news as well, that we can have that level of promotion and drill down. Okay, so I had one last thing I want to talk just before we move on to productivity, which is the connection with the CEO. And I think it's something that we put on the front page of our intranet. So if I scroll down, I'm going to come back to that bit in a minute. The CEO connection, just take me through what this is and what the concept is.
So again, it's about opening up and making the leadership team approachable and accessible. So what we're doing by promoting this on your intranet, you're really highlighting as a leadership team to your organization that you are open for people to ask questions. People can get hold of you. You're not hiding yourselves away and creating an us and them culture. You want to be able to connect and support and have those conversations with people that are out on the front line doing the work as such. So by making that front and center on the homepage, you're really showcasing that that is important to you. And again, it's using that Microsoft Yammer as the tool to support the two-way conversation elements.
Yeah, I think there's two things I would say to that. First, from a technology point of view, a lot of people saying, do I need Yammer as well as Teams? But I think if we look at Yammer as a very much open conversation place, it does play a separate role where Teams tends to be more outcome or project based or maybe operationally based. So there's a separate place for those different kind of conversations. And the second piece is, if you are going to do this kind of CEO connection, where I've seen it most successfully done is where organizations almost have an SLA or a time agreement where if somebody publishes, somebody will get back to that comment within maybe 2 working days or 4 working days. Even if they can't answer the question at that point, they will set expectations of when they can that. Thank you for that feedback. It's going to take some time to work out the answer. We're going to come back to you at the quarter end or whatever it might be. But just setting that expectation, if people publish stuff there's a place where they're going to get an expectation that someone's going to listen to them and they're going to get a response. Then, at which point we've talked a lot about the engagement side. Conscious of time, let's move over to the productivity side. What are the key things that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that we're going to cover. We'll just take you through them. So let's just come to the homepage. So I think the first thing, yes, we showcased at the very beginning that actually bringing people access to the tools that they need is really important. They don't have to save bookmarks, etc. If we just go and edit that page a minute, what we'll see is that when we look at that first link there, Microsoft Dynamics, it's got a little people icon next to it. What this basically means is that this icon or this link has been targeted to a specific group of individuals based on what teams they're a member of. So if I'm in the sales and marketing team, Dynamics has a lot of relevance to me, whereas if I'm perhaps in HR team, maybe less so, depending on what part of Dynamics you're using. The same thing applies to other types of tools, DocuSign or Jira or some of those other more specific tools that are relevant to certain groups of the organization. So by creating targeted links that make it relevant to individuals, instead of trying to have a massive page of all of the tools available, it makes it more relevant for those people and get some quick access to things that they're doing. So the next thing we really need to talk about, we haven't touched at all, is search is one of those underlying sort of foundations of everything in SharePoint, and being able to find your results and get stuff back quickly is one of those key elements of making sure that you can be productive. Yeah, Rupert's just typed in sales here. We can see a few things coming in. If we click through and narrow that down into files, for instance, we'll see a list of documents that we're working on. In our case, we're particularly interested in the sales tracker, but we could go and narrow that down based on the different file types or when that document was last modified. If we compare that experience to how we search for content when we open up our File Explorer and it has to sit and go through, and we watch File Explorer taking minutes to come back and find those results, and they're never what we want. This is doing is, one, reading inside the body of documents to bring results back, but it's also recognizing the context of who you are and who you work with to promote certain results and highlight them, as opposed to things from other people in the organization that you don't interact with that much. So now we've got that result back, Rupert, let's just go and open it. And I think what this does is lead us on to this next concept, which I talk about, which is the idea of a sort of living document or live tracker. So this is something that I've encountered quite a lot in a few different organizations, actually. In our case, we're demonstrating it with this sort of sales tracker here, but I've got one customer in the education space that has this live spreadsheet of all of the books that they're purchasing. That's managed by their book purchasing team, but everyone else wants to have a bit of a read-only view, a dashboard of what's going on. Another customer that we work with, they have a tracker that tracks where their clients are through their standardized delivery process. So their consulting team will go through and manage that tracker within Microsoft Teams somewhere. But then the leadership team want a read-only view, and the sales team, they want some context. That's really important information. And historically, they might have sent email snapshots or created copies of it and emailed it around, or had to go and manually upload it. But what we're going to do is show you how, even though this spreadsheet is being used within a Microsoft Teams somewhere that sales and marketing have got access to, if we go back to our homepage a minute, please, Rupert, what we'll see, have a little scroll down, we'll see that tracker is being embedded onto our SharePoint page. I'll give it a minute and it will load the preview. And actually a particular chart within that spreadsheet is being presented based on live data from that spreadsheet. So as people go through and update that spreadsheet, that data will start to come through as the refresh happens. People will be able to see those changes without having to go and email copies of documents around. As I said, anything where you're tracking things like risk registers or sales trackers, delivery process trackers, for instance, anything like that, project summary lists, for instance, it's a really good way of being able to visualize that and present it out to other people.
Yeah, I think there's two things I'd probably say. Firstly, you wouldn't normally put individual sales targets on the front page of an intranet, but it proves the point. You could have an all-up view. The second thing is this provides a great alternative if you don't want to make the investment into Power BI. Power BI will give you a lot more choices on charts and how that data is presented and where it comes from. But for many organizations where, this Excel spreadsheet, which holds all the nuggets of information, it's a great way to do this. And obviously you can put multiple Excel spreadsheets onto different pages across the site. So you might put this individual on a sales page and it could be locked down in such a way that only certain people can see it, for example. That's for sales tracker. That shows really bringing KPIs and onto the intranet. What else can we do?
Yeah, really, there's two final things that we want to talk about here. And the first is that we haven't really reflected too much, but it's pretty key, is that sort of curated, standardized content. Now, as we said, typically the main owners of content within an intranet are going to be those in support functions. If we hover over the navigation a minute, Rupert, we can see that the main headings here are all about standard resources, people content that everyone needs to benefit from. So again, if we go into our marketing collateral area, If you think within a support service role of the common questions that you get asked, those are the types of things that you really want to push out onto your intranet to reduce your workload, but also make it quicker for people to get what they need. So as we come to this marketing page, we can see we've got nice visual links that take us through to images and logos. We've got some context here, who to ask a question if you need some more things. But if we go and click perhaps into our logos area, ultimately this is taking us into something that looks a bit more like a sort of file share experience. But instead of just giving people access to a folder structure and expecting them to navigate it down, we're guiding them on the journey of how to find that information and providing context all the way, instead of just saying, here's a folder of things, you go and look through and find the stuff that you think is relevant. We're actually guiding them through that process.
And that gives you confidence, Ben. I think that you're looking at, quotes, the official version of the truth rather than are these last year's logos, are these this year's logos. So that should really help reduce the number of requests you get for that repetitive, please send me the logo, please send me the boilerplate for our company.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I think talking about those requests that come through to marketing, let's just go and click through onto our submit a marketing request page here. You find in IT, they will often have IT ticket systems in place already, but marketing teams are often having to respond based on email requests that come through and effectively managing their workload through a marketing shared mailbox. And actually, quite often they can get perhaps a bit pressured. There's no kind of visibility on how urgent something is. So what we're doing here is showing how you can create a simple request tracker that allows someone to submit a request, notify marketing of that request, and allow the individual to see where that request is, what the progress is. Is it still open? Have marketing given a response? Has it been captured already? When is it likely to be due? So instead of having to just, rely on marketing being bombarded by emails, they can start funneling the requests and helping them prioritize the work they do. So you could even update this form and have something that says, is this really urgent? Does it need to be due by this week, or can it wait for next week? Those types of things. This concept, when I show it to marketing teams, I say, yeah, it'd be really powerful, a way of being able to just narrow down and manage the requests that are coming in, whereas IT will often have something in place to support that already.
Yeah. And I guess as a final step, before we move on to the final piece, Ben, is you could put a workflow in there. So there's a cost element attached to it, but somebody with the appropriate budget can sign that off and have someone to approve it.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than just requesting and requesting. So Ben, you talked about 2 points. This was one of them. What's the final one?
So the final one, which we did mention at the start, is this concept of knowledge. If we think about what is going to make people productive, well, being productive is about being able to get to things or do things more quickly, and having access to a library or repository of knowledge information is really going to help us do that. So I'm not having to reinvent the wheel every time. When we think about knowledge, though, we need to think of 2 types. The first is knowledge that is effectively written down. So that's codified documents, examples, guides, etc., process diagrams. But then also we need to think about capturing the knowledge that's inside people's heads, the knowledge that effectively has that organizational experience. If people have worked on projects over time, how do we tap into that previous experience that our colleagues have, or for instance, that new joiners have brought from other companies as they come and work for us? So let's just look at the first one then. What we can see initially, Rupert's going through and just doing a little search for some content here. So Rupert searched for a user guide, and we can see all of this sort of examples of good documents that have come through. But actually, we've got a lot of things like statements of work here. And what this is highlighting is that these documents have got the phrase user guide in the body. So this search is reading inside the body of those documents to bring back anything where user guide is mentioned. But actually what we want to do is filter this down to show only documents that have been classified as a user guide. So Rupert's just gone through and clicked on that filter. Now we can see those definitive documents that are classified as user guide, as opposed to simply referencing that phrase in the body of the content. So effectively having some form of information management worker that curates the good content, the examples, the case studies, the good stuff that you've been working on, and classifying it so that everyone else can benefit from it is really important. But then on the right hand side, we're tapping into that tacit knowledge that's in people's heads. If we create a place where people can ask questions and ask for help, how do I go through and do this process? Has anyone actually experienced working in this sector before? Have we got anyone that speaks French? Because we've got a customer that primarily speaks in French, for instance. How do we tap into that? And then again, as we showed you before, someone can raise that question, someone else can answer it, and then people could go and mark that and say, yeah, that's the best answer for that question. That's the one that we want to go and upvote.
Perfect, Ben. Look, conscious of time, I think if people are interested about the knowledge piece, we did do a webinar on that, on the sales to delivery to support process, and we dived into knowledge a bit further on that one. So if that's of interest, that video on YouTube is a good one. It's under our channel, Information EXP. So I just want to summarize, Ben, before we dive into Q&A, if that's okay with you. So what we see now on the productivity side is that personalized experience. So we're having the right apps, the right content based on you, your role, your department appearing on your homepage. The second thing is we talked about curated content. So particularly that knowledge piece right there, it does take a little bit of effort to tag your knowledge, but you saw the power that once it's tagged correctly, it's so much easier to find and people are going to use it. It doesn't really work if you just dump everything into a document library and hope for the best. The second part of that is, which we touched upon our previous webinar also, was typically you don't put everything into a knowledge base. You think carefully about what's actually going to add value down the line. The third piece around productivity is your intranet is a place to get help. How can I lean on the expertise of the organization, other people? So it might not be written down, but I can find people with those skills, talents, or find a place where I cannot raise those questions. So you saw an example in the sales site. I've got an opportunity. Who do I speak to? But we also saw an example in the knowledge site as well. So if you bring all this together, then you create your intranet as a place where people want to start work. And that's going to drive that both engagement piece and that productivity piece. So that all sat in SharePoint, Microsoft Teams. There's no fancy code behind any of that. We've been using the tools out of the box, which Microsoft give you. So with that, I'm going to dive into the Q&A. And question did pop up earlier, which is nervousness around publishing news without an approval process. What happens if people write things which aren't quite on message? So what do you see in your experience about approval processes around news, particularly when you're delegating out to teams, departments?
Yeah, I think really, again, this depends on the nature of the organization that you work in and what their sort of inherent company culture is. But yes, you can implement news approval processes in SharePoint. My general recommendation is to try and avoid doing that. If you want to devolve content out to people, we prefer the approach of using templates so that you can guide the set of questions. You're not just giving them a blank sheet of paper to go and create their content. They're filling out details that you've mapped out for them. And provided that you're keeping a bit of a loose eye and a loose look over the content that's published to filter out anything that could be problematic, we generally think that is going to be the best way of actually getting people to engage. If people have got lots of hoops that they've got to jump through to fill out their content, then the likelihood is that they're just not going to do it. Yes, whilst news approval processes technically can be done, I would be wary of enforcing them and instead focus on putting good templates and empowering people to be able to say what they want to say.
Yeah, I think two things I'd add to that. Post moderation certainly is something you could look at. So if somebody publishes something and it's not quite where you want it to be, go back to the person and give them feedback and let them update it. But if you are in a regulatory environment where things from certain departments or teams need to be double checked, then yes, we can put workflow around that. And then final question, unless anyone else ever come up, Ben, what comes first? Is it my document management system or is it my intranet, considering that SharePoint can support both?
Yes, I think what we often find, particularly with the SMB sort of size of organizations, is actually quite often the requirement that comes in is how you manage policies and procedures and put a formal structure around it. So we have a few organizations that for regulatory reasons, they're ISO compliant, for instance, and they need to structure their policies and procedures, ensure that they're going through appropriate approval processes and manage that kind of quality management system. So that quite often that productivity and formal quality management is the driving requirement, and that requires quite a lot of thought to go through. And then the intranet is the thing that comes on top of that. So how do we then surface that up into a more formal company portal?
Yeah. Okay. Just conscious of time, Ben, and I know there's another question or two coming up. So Next question, Ben. How do you embed SharePoint into Teams? Probably get more on the technical side here, but I suspect something to do with Microsoft's Viva announcements.
Yeah, absolutely. So the mechanism that we're using, for those that want to do a bit of digging into this, we're using a mechanism called Microsoft Viva Connections, which is ultimately quite a lot of marketing speak from Microsoft, but really it's just a technical way of making your intranet come through into Microsoft Teams. So there are some articles out there that Microsoft have published that talk you how to do that.
Yeah, and it does a little bit more as well. So if I click on the actual hub again, you can see it surfaces up where I've been working and also news. So it does a little bit more than just produce an icon there, which we've dropped on there. Final question is, how much time and resources are involved in keeping your intranet relevant and up to date?
This is a really important question, and I think, and obviously quite a difficult one to answer. It's a little bit of the how long is a piece of string conversation. But what I would say, if you always think it and break it down into those two areas we've talked about. So the first being productivity and making sure that the tools and resources are kept up to date and relevant. And then the second being the employee engagement piece. And again, what we showed is how you can break even employee engagement down into multiple layers of news content. The fact is there are no shortcuts to this. So it is something that you will need to put time into doing. So the way that you create news needs to be thought through. And as I said at the start of this, simply relaying the news stories that you have on your website, so because it looks like something is changing, it doesn't really add an awful lot of value to the end user. So thinking about who within your leadership team, maybe each person is responsible for doing one news article a week or a month or whatever that cadence is going to be. So the hardest bit is putting the effort into doing the content. There will be a little bit of time you need to put into sort of training, encouraging the different departments to be able to share their stories. So getting those templates in place. Again, it's how do you encourage and support that?
Yeah, just a real world experience there is that organizations where they've delegated that creation of content down to in teams normally highlight somebody within that team, and they might just loop together for an hour each month to make sure people are still comfortable publishing content ideas, because some people just don't know what to publish if it's relevant. Templates can certainly help. So it could be as little as a couple of hours a month. But what we do find is actually, once you give people the tools and the capability, people do want to do it. They do want to talk about what they do. So it's about identifying the right person who's happy to be a champion for that department or team.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I'm not going to pretend it, it does take time. People have to set aside the time to be able to do it. But again, if you break it down into what is each role meant to be doing, if HR have got content that they need, if they're spending all of their time answering questions on email, well, really, it's spending half a day and pulling together some content and putting that onto a homepage and then directing people to that will save people time in the long run, if that makes sense. Yeah.
If you're looking to start, we've looked at an intranet workshop, because as you can tell, there's a bit of fact finding which needs to kick off first, i.e. what's your vision, challenge, goals. So not everyone knows what that is or can be. And so we look at the art of the possible, saying, look, this is what we've seen with other organizations. So let's take you, rather than express 45-minute tour of what SharePoint can do, we go into a lot more detail and take it more from a day in a life of experience. And then in that fact-finding piece, we then talked back about that charter. So what's that Intranet Charter look like? Following on from that, we do a second workshop which dives into scoping. So where are you right now? A lot of people have made some progress in SharePoint, but maybe they want to put some more clarity or governance around it, but also want to see how the bit they've done maybe fits into an overall picture. So what does that overall solution architecture look like, and that roadmap? And finally, within various teams, we know that you've got experience in SharePoint, or you've got experience in technologies around this. So there's going to be a role saying, well, what role do you want to play in any kind of engagement? So we explore that as well. So that's how we start with our Intranet workshop. Okay, I think we're going to call it a wrap there. It's 2:00, so thank you all for your time, and we'll follow up with a video and the deck in the next few days.